Francis Sullivan, thank you for joining us on Common Home TV.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. Thanks, Matt.
Well, also, I would be remiss if I didn't begin for myself and for every Catholic that I know to not give you a heartfelt thank you for all your tireless dedication and work that you've been doing over the years. So just thank you.
Thanks very much. I mean, there's plenty of people doing hard work, mate.
Cheers. What are the positives that the Australian Church is getting right with the relationship with the vulnerable?
Well, obviously, look, the tradition of Catholic social thought places people who are disadvantaged, people who are in need of particular attention, like the preference for the poor, as they call it. That's right at the heart of Catholic social thought. And therefore, Catholic social services, generally outreach programs, even the pastoral disposition and instinct that Pope Francis speaks of. All of this is grounded in that tradition of Catholic social thought that says that to be truly followers of Jesus, we need to walk with the poor, but also assist to make their lives better, enabling them to flourish like the rest of us.
When we speak of the clerical sexual abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, I find often it harkens back to like a 20-year time span. At least I hear it often in the popular culture, or when I'm with mates or which not that confront me with this sort of dialogue, those who still even care enough to engage. How long has clerical sexual abuse really been around?
Oh, good question. I mean, some of the research has shown that the abuse, particularly of younger boys, stretches back centuries in the church. And of course, wherever there is the opportunity, then some opportunists take it, whether it's in the church or elsewhere. The way this debate has been progressed in Australia, at least, and probably across the Western world for the Catholic Church, has really emphasised, say, the last 50 years or so, because that's when the data has been better available. That's when statistics can be relied on. So in some sense, that's why you'll hear people say, oh, well, 20 years ago this happened and so on. So it depends then again what you're talking about and what are we trying to emphasise.
Excellent. Well, if you notice, I use the term that I thought of sort of last night when speaking, because relationship with the vulnerable, because we often speak of safeguarding, which you know quite well. And this is, to me, become a sort of way to show concrete steps. It allows us a little bit of relief from the shame that is deservedly so felt by not just the clergy, by lay people, by all people that were around. It's a moment of, okay, we can do something. Look, we're doing something. We don't like this either. Something is being done. And unfortunately, I feel that some, not all, also feel that this allows them to have a done and dusted role. Look, mate, safeguarding, we're on it. I see this, by the way, I see this also in secular institutions, which we'll get to later. While this helps the treatment, do you feel the church has truly moved to address the underlying causes of the abuse? And if so, what do you think those causes are?
Well, Matt, this is the way you articulated that, I think, is the basic dilemma that challenges the church. There are always two schools of thought. And as you say, this applies with most institutions. And that's one line that goes like this: look, there are bad apples in the bunch. Let's not deny that. And the idea is to get the bad apples out of the bunch. And to make sure we don't get any more bad apples, let's put in place a whole series of guidelines and safeguarding measures. And let's make sure that, we've got all of our compliances and standards in place. Sure. Then there's the second question. How come it happens in a place like the Catholic Church? A place where all of us, in our heart, have a commitment to relationships, have a commitment to what we think is leading a decent life in the interests of the community more broadly, right? That's why we're doing it. And why we were so confronted, or why I was so confronted by the realities of clerical sexual abuse, is that it actually tore at the heart of what we are. It basically said to us, there is just something really out of order here. And people like us who profess a commitment to a way of life were actually living a lie. And then the worst part about it was that the institution decided to conceal the lie. So the deeper question is always, what is it about our culture as a church that enabled that to happen? And that is the confronting question. That's why some people say, oh gosh, I don't want to go there. I will cooperate around safeguarding. And I actually just want to get on with my life, the life I'm living now. I don't want to have to get embroiled in all of this stuff because it sounds to me like it gets controversial. Some people want to call it a culture war. Some people want to say, look, it's sounding like you're being a little too hard on people. It's very demoralizing. Yep, welcome to the wound. Because clerical sex abuse has absolutely wounded the heart of the church. And we can only, it seems to me, get to a place of healing if we can confront the real truth of what happened. And that is really difficult for a lot of people. I understand it, particularly people who are in official roles like bishops and religious leaders. It's like role conflict for them, because I think privately they know the depth of this. And then in their responsibilities, they're saying, well, we've got to try and hold the show together. And we've got to juggle with this, that, and the other issue. But unfortunately, this is the type of wound that has also exacerbated other wounds. And so now we as Catholics, at least in Australia, that's all I can speak about. We carry a deep grief about our church. And that grief can sometimes evidence itself in other issues, in other reactions. It also, in a sense, gives expression to anger and frustration that people have with the church. So it becomes this huge melting pot of issues. And, we just had the Plenary Council. I was a member of it. And in part, it was on display there. But, it was a carefully orchestrated event, and a lot of the really deeper issues we never got to.
Well, I guess that leads into my next question about the motions at the Plenary Council, 2.1 and 2.2. Do you find these at least, if I was using that analogy of like covering the wound type thing, not like, as you say, did it at least speak to sufficiently to safeguarding in your estimation?
Sure. I think the motions were another step along the path, and I commend people for working on that. And I thought they crafted the motions well to bring people along, because the key here, of course, is we're a faith community, so it's the community that's got to walk together, not just individuals, right? And I thought the safeguarding measures were well crafted, and I'm glad to see that in the debate, if you want to call it that, around the motions, there was also the recognition that we do need to examine the systemic issues. That's another way of saying the cultural issues that have not only enabled abuse of vulnerable people to occur and still occurs, but also the propensity, the instinct to be defensive, to conceal, to justify, and also to confront the, as even Pope Francis calls it, the culture of clericalism.
Well, that culture of clericalism, it has lots of different, and this isn't specific priests, right? And that's why I think it's hard to speak to it, because there's great priests, I could, so many just off the top of my head, ages to list. So the word clericalism is about something a little bit, it's a concept a little bit bigger, but it leaks into both the sex abuse crisis, it leaks into a lot of the issues that we're having in the church at present. Was that addressed in the plenary council in any way that you think made any strides, that was brought up in any meaningful way, or was it something that really wasn't sufficiently addressed?
Look, it was mentioned in one minor intervention, as far as I was concerned, and there were reactions on both sides. Let me, if you don't mind, let me just make a little commentary around that. What we understand as clericalism is ultimately the abuse of power by the clerical structure in the church. And sometimes that is done by a cleric, and sometimes it's done by lay people, you know, pulling rank, abusing power.
Oh yeah.
So let's leave it like that as the sort of sense of what we're talking about. Because ultimately, when we talk about the sex abuse scandal, concealment, cover-up, and complicity was the result of the abuse of power. And oftentimes it was done by clerics for clerics. So there was also this club mentality of protection. And also there's this entitlement privilege element to that, that clerics were treated differently. And we know that's true, that clerics were in a sense managed through the process, and other times lay people were dismissed. And so it's one rule for one for another. It has many faces to this. But underneath it all, of course, the thing that we all need to confront is our church is actually structured on the fact that clerics are more important than lay people. That in the canon law, clerics have different rights to lay people. That in a sense, the whole show is structured like a wedding cake, that there are tiers here and lay people are at the bottom. That even in the liturgies the formal liturgy masses that we had, it was still very difficult for them to structure the actual architecture of the liturgies to make it look any different than the clerics first, the lay second. And so this is part of our culture that we need to confront, in my mind. You know, I haven't got all the answers. But what I found time and time again, when I listened over 6 years to victims of child sexual abuse, and I went to hundreds of parish-based meetings of an evening and spoke to parishioners, that the dysfunctional exercise of power and authority is actually now causing people to stop participating. And it's playing out with people who we used to call the rusted on. It's playing out with people who are just decent people. They're not sort of firebrands, you know, and it's because it's demonstrating a massive disconnect as a church and the way we organize ourselves internally with the way we normally organize ourselves in everyday life, in our workplaces, in other secular organizations. So you have this great sort of, you know, disconnect, like when it comes to questions like men and women in society, we say men and women are equal. And up until the other day, we used to say in the church that men and women were mutual. In society, we used to say, let's make decisions in a democratic way. In the church, we say, let's make decisions in a hierarchical way, where the bishop always has the veto vote. In society, we say, let's make our moral decisions in sort of relational ethics. And in the church, we still have a knee jerk to make our ethical decisions based on rules. And so there's a clash of civilizations here. And at the heart of one of the problems is how the exercise of clericalism really plays out.
Mm. Well, moving a little bit from clericalism to the lay, to the issues surrounding sort of what laity also is in some ways complicit with some of the surroundings of your work. If I look at what John Warhurst put out, when I put that on social media, I noticed when he spoke about transparency and accountability, I know how social media works. I've written papers on it. People read the headline and tuned out. That were Catholics that were saying, wait a minute, this media is criticizing the Catholic Church. I was following you up to yesterday when you were talking about prayer or a meditation or even a something social justice, something environmental. This idea of what are you talking about? I will not follow you anymore. And further than that, we had people commenting, let's just see how this plays out. You're jumping the gun. Obviously, they didn't click the video, but that besides the point, the knee-jerk reaction, defend. And can you speak a little bit about that, as well as perhaps it's time to start questioning Catholic media itself in a bit of a role of complicity, because it's not, I don't see many people speaking about, oh, this transparency issue isn't really brought up. Or I've been here 14 years in Catholic press, and there was a time before Royal Commission where people weren't getting awards for writing articles about child sexual abuse, but I think we all knew it was there. But when the secular media brought it up and did an external critique, well, now it was time for the bravery. So where do we play a role? Where do lay people play a role in this as well? Because it can't just be clericalism. I don't think it can solely be on just the priests.
Well, that's a big set of questions there. Firstly, as far as John goes, John Warhurst, I personally think you wouldn't find a more considered, committed
measured
Catholic who's prepared to roll their sleeves up and get involved rather than bark from the sidelines. And I think he's always very measured in his commentary, and people would do well to do more than read the headline. Secondly, of course, Catholics, I'm still a practicing Catholic, and okay, that might be a museum piece, but that's just how it is. And we by instinct can be tribal. We identify as Catholics. A lot of people in contemporary society don't identify as any grouping, do they? They might identify us with some background, but we identify. And that's one of the strengths of the Catholic Church, that its identity is pretty robust. But what we have been finding is that if we're not careful, we will think that there's only one, if you like, identity as a Catholic. We have a very rich tradition which offers us many pathways to be Catholic. And of course, at the heart of it all is to have a nourishing prayer life, a nourishing liturgical life, and in the Catholic world, a nourishing sacramental life. That is part of the gig. And we express that then in our social works, formally, but we also express that in how we move in the world as an individual. So that's our package. And obviously some people get threatened and therefore defensive when people are speaking back into the group about the realities they see. That is our challenge. And as lay Catholics, we have as much responsibility about reforming our church as people in responsible positions, be they clerics or anybody else. I mean, we're all in this show together. And as has been said for some time, We are all equal because we're baptized.
Mm.
Okay, the positions you hold sometimes give you more power and influence and control and a say, but that's not based on your baptism. Sometimes it's based on your good fortune of being an insider or whatever. So I think it's important that we can step back and recognize that one of the beauties of Catholicism is that there is unity across diversity. It's not unity through diversity, but it's the unity of recognizing that what is diverse is the same as anything else. That's the whole teaching we have on creation. You know, as I say, God doesn't create junk, right?
Mm.
So in that sense of unity is also the unity of diverse opinion. And inside that is the unity that comes from communal discernment. That eventually we say we walk together this way as a faith community, that we hear the critique or we hear the insights, we pause, and then we walk together. That's my definition of what the synodality concept is, and it's my sense of how we can hold things together.
Well,
and of course, human beings are human beings, and there'll be times when everything gets passionate and looks divisive. And but the beauty of the show is that ultimately, if we want to remain in the show, you remain in it with a commitment to walk together.
mm. Yeah, that's an excellent response to synodality. But I guess it's kind of a good segue to speaking about more of an international context. It's, you know, we have to be smart enough to think about the church as a universal church, as you were mentioning, like the diversity and, you know, the different cultures. We're all not sort of exactly in the same place. And I speak for myself. My opinion might not be the exact same opinion on certain issues as other Catholics. And how do we walk together, right? But, and especially like if I come up with one of my beliefs coming up to sort of lecture somebody in Africa, that doesn't really look good or work good and seems ethnocentric, and I get all of that. But do you see in other countries that haven't explored the child sexual abuse, do you see the next 20 years as a place where this is going to start bubbling up regardless of our input or not? Where we're going to see more cases, or we're going to see truth and healing commissions be set up that aren't just in the West? Because in the West, we've seen this in the United States and in Ireland.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, you know, if history's any teacher, the answer is probably yes. That in most countries where the sex abuse scandal has really blown up, it's been the result of the external media. They've really pushed it. There are very few situations where the church itself has come out and opens its books readily to the world to say this is what's going on. Secondly, in some countries, of course, culturally, issues like this are somewhat taboo to talk about. So that in itself contains things, and it may take time in some countries for this to become more of a public issue. But I think going back to the first part of your question, even through the Pope's commission on the protection of minors, which was established during our Royal Commission time, the whole point there was to be a reference point for any of the churches anywhere in the world to have some resources in order to start the process if they were at that point, or to continue a process of renewal and reform and putting in place, like we discussed at the beginning of the show. And, you know, the Vatican is pretty adept to being able to juggle the cultural differences across the world.
Mm.
I'd like to say one thing, though, if I could. The Australian Catholic Church can't wait for the rest of the Catholic Church to catch up when it comes to some of the issues that we need to confront. And that is, we can't be merely mouthed about reforms because maybe these are going to impact on the universal teachings of the church. We as a church in Australia need to be bold about saying there's some elements of the teaching we want addressed. Yep, sure, in universal forums. Yes, we want them addressed in the appropriate ways that impact into the various curial departments. But we've got to start naming those things in bold ways and not be too apologetic about where our mindset is as an Australian church. And that includes in the sex abuse scandal. I think there are issues that we have still been merely mouthed about, which do require us standing up, even back into the various, let's call them procedural processes of the Vatican.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned about the power. So we'll speak a little bit about what's going on in some secular institutions even today, because Hockey Canada, my accent, I'm from Canada, is just got some allegations and more bubbling up. The Stanley Cup is the hardest trophy in sports to win, and it's a religion where I'm from. It's a predominant religion. It's a religion people punch each other in the face playing hockey all the time for. They go to the wall, they'll run through a wall for it. And the Chicago Blackhawks had an issue with a coach and a minor, and they passed him on to somewhere else, a high school, and they went against the press. And recently, when they were questioned to follow up their safeguarding routines, the answer from the president was so vitriolic, like, we are done our safeguarding, this is over, we don't talk about it. The power mindset and abuse in institutions are playing out in so many ways. So it's also hard to criticize the church and say, oh, this is how Catholics act. This is part of just being Catholic, is to cover up and do these things. I see it happening in the secular world. Is there a resource for us to sort of reach out in these instances and say, point to your work and say, look, this power thing, we've got pages and pages of writing on it. How can we help in sort of these instances to say, to put our voice and say, like, as people who are trying to take ownership of a legacy which has problems, how can we reach out, or is this just not our place?
Oh, look, I think it's a mixed answer, to be honest. I think if we've got our act together and demonstrated that our actions speak louder than our words, then we have some credibility. But I think for a good period of time, there were so many holes in our approach. We were vulnerable to be looking like hypocrites. So until we get our act together, until we can point very clearly to a culture that is not abusive. And let's not forget, when we talk about vulnerable people, we're not talking just about children. We're talking about people, say, in pastoral settings who are vulnerable and therefore at risk. We're talking about, as we did at the plenary, about, are we treating men and women with equal dignity? And if we are, that means with equal rights. That's the kicker there. It's one thing to, because, it sort of made me smile when we said we're going to treat men and women with equal dignity. And yet it's the basic teaching of our church that everyone is born with inherent dignity. So we had to come along and have a motion about that. Now, I found that a bit strange, but what I found interesting is that if we take it to its logical conclusions, that men and women have equal rights, now that's when the rubber hits the road.
Yeah.
And so the world looks at us and has a view. It's probably got a view which says we are behind the times. So then to say back into the world, well, hey, why don't we give you a hand on how to deal with sexual abuse and accountability and transparency? It might be a bit early for that.
Mm-hmm.
That said, let's not discount in this conversation the massive changes that have occurred in the Catholic Church with regard to addressing these issues and being more transparent and being more accountable and being more prepared for public scrutiny and being more open about involving the authorities like the police. It is light years away from the 70s and 80s, to just name some times. And the one thing that I think the church can say as a formal institution is that it made itself vulnerable in the public inquiry. It did not go in there with a defensive attitude. It, for the first time in the world, the Catholic Church of Australia volunteered to open its books. So the Royal Commission saw all the data. There was nothing hidden. Whereas in other jurisdictions, in other parts of the world, the Catholic Church has gone to the court to try and stop their book being open. I think that was quite a marked difference. And in a sense, it demonstrates the attitude that maybe Australians bring to this that other parts of the world don't. Because ultimately, when visitors come to Australia, I think they're blown over by the sort of egalitarian spirit that's in the Catholic Church.
100%. And I think that also speaks, I'm a dual citizen now, so I can speak as an Australian as of last year. That fair go, just coming from a North American context, as much as I feel Canada is much more Commonwealth, the cultural difference of that fair go is really, really, it's palpable here. So I think that translating that to the Catholic Church just makes absolute sense. One of the things that I noticed in this recently, just in the conversations that kind of brought to life, was also this has effect. We talk about the effects of the women and equality, but it also has effect on lay men, right? And their position to affect change within the Catholic Church. That's something that I think hasn't really been addressed too much, I guess, because of the standing of women, and like you said, there has to be a vote on dignity and so forth. And oftentimes, when men reach levels of power within the Catholic Church, they're older and formed in a way that is much more akin to being able to act in the clerical establishment. Do you see any movements for a male empowerment? I mean, I guess that's not the best word, but a way forward for men to more fully participate as well.
Yes, look, I have to be open. I'm probably a beneficiary of that because, I've had roles in the Catholic Church, very senior roles. I've was on a pontifical council in the Vatican for 5 years. And I've been very lucky in my roles, and I've mixed in those circles and had influence. So I've had to be very careful that I also didn't get caught. I hope I didn't get caught too much in that fulcrum. That said, just by sheer necessity in Australia, lay men and women will need to roll their sleeves up and be part of the governance and management of the institution in Australia. It's simply a numbers game. You need the people. And what we have to also do is to properly form people for these roles. It's all very fine to say to someone, hey, we want you on the finance committee, or we want you now to be part of the Diocesan Pastoral Council. Well, the days of picking winners have got to be over. We've got to have a much more transparent, open process of appointment and participation so that we've got people coming that demonstrate the diversity of the faith community that we're trying to build. And this is the key. In the past, sometimes, you'd pick your mates or someone you thought was orthodox enough or a proper Catholic, all that sort of thing. Even though, you ask somebody, well, tell me what a proper Catholic is. That's a good quiz night question, So I think this whole lay participation has many layers to it that will involve formation of people, support for people, even getting even getting the show accustomed to clerics and lays sitting around the table, shoulder to shoulder in the same direction, in a sense, working together, no threat. I mean, in the days when, the sectors I've been involved with, which are health, aged care, and welfare services, lay people run those. Lay people govern those because religious personnel aren't there anymore, right? The average age of the religious congregations involved in those ministries is well into their 70s. The literal number of people is small. And they, as religious congregations and religious institutes, had the foresight decades ago of setting up structures and processes because they saw this coming. And I think the issue really is the diocesan expression of the church, I think, has not been as prepared. And they need to learn a bit from the other aspects of the church.
Yep.
Women in governance, in religious congregations and their services is just a norm. Lay people taking on canonical roles of governance through the emergence of the public juridic person structures is now the norm.
Mm-hmm.
People being formed, doing courses, becoming articulate and confident about their faith in these ministries is the norm. So, for example, there are many aspects and many faces of the church, and sometimes in our conversations, we can too narrowly define, or confine is a better word, the identity of the church. Identity is important, but essence is more important. And we as Catholics, at our heart, are attempting to try and live the gospel message. That's the essence. Following Jesus, being attentive to the Spirit. That's the essence. Our identity is how that's expressed. Our identity is in our, if you like, our positions in relationships in society. But that identity needs to change in order for the essence of what we're about to be preserved. That's our challenge in a modern world.
That is excellent. This is really the thrust of why Common Home TV exists, to explore that, because the change, when you look at the rise of the knowns and the coming down of religious, in that flux, to keep the essence and to move forward in a way that people can relate to. And I would just like to second what you say, because I've seen it in person, how some of the sisters have prepared for this marvelously. I've heard female CEOs that are lay profess things in public forums that show a really good formation, like an excellent formation. And that they're in that position in healthcare, in social services, because of also having business acumen and being very astute and very good at their jobs. I don't want to keep it too long, so I want to ask you one final question. Throughout your time working as Chief Executive Officer for the Truth, Justice, and Healing Council, you must have been witness to the most heartbreaking and tragic stories about abuse, but I also assume some of courage and resilience. So if I was to ask you to nominate a patron saint of clerical sexual abuse, who would it be and why? And if you're not comfortable with that language, you could share a story of somebody who you could hold up as something, or a story or a person or an event that we can look to as people of faith to draw wisdom from.
Yeah, well, there are, I'll do it another way, because for me, I went, when it was announced that I would take on this role, one of the first things I said, it's important for us to really hear the lived experience of people who have been victims. And so I was invited to a meeting of victims, and there was about 25, 30 people at this meeting, and they sat around the room in a big circle. And they asked me to sit in the middle. And then over the next 2 hours, each person told their story uninterrupted. It was a very intense experience for me. And it was actually the very first time that I'd ever been in an experience like that. I hadn't met a person who'd been sexually abused in the church. As a matter of fact, I'd only ever met one person in my life who had been abused in their family. So I'd had a fairly protected life. Mm. So anyway, this experience happens. And at the end of the meeting, they said, well, what do you want to say? And I was, really, I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings. I didn't want to dismiss what was being said. I certainly didn't want to make excuses. So I just said to people, I was thankful for them and their courage. And then one person who had spoken was a businessman, and he had come from work to the meeting. And he said to me, well, I've been watching you for the whole 2 hours, and I've heard what you've had to say on the radio and the TV since you've started this job. And I just want to say one thing to you. Don't you dare let us down again. Now that challenge, was seared in my heart, and it carried me through every day, because I realized what he was saying to me was, it's so hard to get our voice heard and for it to be in the center of things. And in a sense, he was a saint, because for me, a saint in our church is someone who holds a mirror up to ourselves. And he challenged me to keep in front of my mind every day the plight of people who'd been abused. And I don't know whether I did a good job on that or not, to be honest. And some days I'm sure I didn't. But what I want to say is that as we started this whole interview, if our expression of being a Catholic today doesn't in some way echo the commitment to reach out to others, particularly those who are vulnerable, then we are actually not living the full message of what we proclaim. And in some sense, like Pope Francis says, if we are able to be a poor church of the poor, which I take to mean, if we are prepared to be vulnerable ourselves, then we are on the path that Jesus walked. And ultimately a saint points to that path. So that's who I think we could canonize.
Francis Sullivan, we thank you so much for your time, and I can't thank you enough for your work. I couldn't imagine how emotionally draining and how strong you'd have to be to just live through it, but also the way you held yourself throughout this whole process. So on behalf of Commonweal TV, thank you very much for your time and your work.
Thanks very much, Matt. I really enjoyed the interview. Thanks
Thank
a lot.
Cheers.